Okay, I will welcome everybody. All right, good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight, and thanks to everybody joining us online as well. We're very pleased to welcome Johanna D. Wickman, who will speak to us about undeservedly forgotten figure of Kansas history. So please join me in welcoming Johanna Wickman.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. Just a quick poll. How many of you have heard of Preston Plumb? I know you two know. All right, a few of you. If you haven't, that's okay. There's a reason I called the book The Forgotten Senator, so please don't feel bad if you have not heard from him. But he is probably one of Kansas's most prolific U.S. senators. He's heavily involved in the Bleeding Kansas history of Kansas, the Civil War. He's one of the founders of the town of Emporia and one of the most accomplished senators, U.S. senators that Kansas has ever had. So he did a lot of things in his life. He did more things in one lifetime than most people do in three. So we're going to go through this kind of fast. So please, if you have any questions or you want to find out more about things, just ask me at the end. Otherwise, we're going to kind of zoom through his life a little bit. So his early life, mauled by a bear at age 9. Boy, what a way to start, right? He was born in 1837 in Berkshire, Ohio. And right near the family homestead there was another family who kept 2 pet bears chained in an outbuilding, as one does. And they also put in a swing inside the building right next to where they kept the 2 bears, as one does. So 9-year-old Preston Plumb was there pushing one of his friends on the swing, and he slipped and fell and rolled right into the clutches of one of these grizzly bears. And was horrifically mauled. For a while, it was not known if he was going to survive. He had scars all over his abdomen, and he ended up losing about 1 pound of flesh on his leg. So in a way, it sort of crippled him. But he was a tough kid. His family came from limited means. His father was a wagon maker, but both of his parents really wanted more for him. He was the oldest. And they wanted him to have a career. They wanted him to go out and do things. They didn't want him to follow into the family business. And so he really wanted to go to Kenyon College, but the family did not have the money to afford to send him to that school. It was a very prestigious school at the time, and tuition was expensive. So he paid his way through college by being a printer. So he worked on campus as a printer. His job was to set the type for Bibles, which if you can imagine setting the type, all those tiny little letters. But for him, it was fantastic. He really loved the printing trade. And that's going to have a huge impact on his life later on. And also what's going on in 1854 is, of course, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And being in Lawrence, I'm sure all of you are very familiar with Bleeding Kansas and the start of that in 1854, so I will save time and not go into that. After he graduates college, he starts the Xenia News in Ohio, also in 1854. He's 16 years old and starts his first newspaper. Now, I don't know what you guys were doing at 16. Starting my own business was not something that I was even remotely thinking of. But not only does he start his own newspaper, he starts a very successful newspaper. Its circulation spreads far beyond Ohio. It is a Free State-leaning newspaper. Plumb is very interested in the Free State movement. After the sacking of Lawrence in 1856, he becomes very interested in the Free State movement. What happened was a man who was from Lawrence, who had survived, came to Ohio. And he was giving a speech. He was trying to recruit money for the cause to take back to the Kansas territory. And Plumb was there as basically a newspaper reporter. He wanted to write an article for his newspaper. And he became so interested in the Free State movement, he said, that's it, I'm going to Kansas. And so he left about 2 weeks later. When he said he was going to Kansas, he was going. And what he did was pretty amazing. He actually became a traveling newspaper correspondent for the Xenia News in Ohio. He traveled all over the Kansas territory. He spent a lot of time in Lawrence. He interviewed Sheriff Jones. He interviewed a lot of the big name characters, figures of that time period. And then he wrote everything down and mailed these letters back to his newspaper in Xenia where they were printed. And so it was basically a diary of a newspaper correspondent traveling the area in 1856. He goes back to Xenia, Ohio in the late fall of 56 and decides, I am moving to Kansas. I want to be involved in the Free State movement. And so he moves to Kansas by way of attending a Free State convention in Iowa and smuggling weapons into Kansas. Because why just move? Why not bring weapons with you? So at this time, he's 19 years old. He's in charge of a company of about a dozen men. They call themselves the Grizzlies. I don't know if that's in reference to his bear mauling or something else. But they have 3 wagons of weapons. They have a dismantled cannon, they have Bowie knives, they have hundreds of Sharps rifles, thousands of rounds of ammunition, and they're heading from Iowa down to Topeka, Kansas. And Plumb is actually wearing riding boots with a thick heel, which he finds out very quickly are not good for walking. So he actually spends a lot of the time walking from Iowa to Topeka barefoot, if you can imagine. But he makes it. The weapons are successfully delivered to Topeka, and so the next thing he does is he heads to Lawrence, and he gets a job as foreman at the Herald of Freedom newspaper, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. There's a couple of neat stories about his time at the Herald of Freedom. I'll just read one of them here that's mentioned in my book. This is a short one. G.W. Brown, editor of the newspaper owner, sent his wife east to get money with which to reestablish his paper. She went in the summer of 1856, and she told of the sufferings of the Free State settlers in Kansas and how Lawrence had been burned by the ruffians and the papers destroyed. Mrs. Brown returned with about $8,000. The money was principally in $2 bills, but there were many 5s and 10s. Brown had a brass rule made, and Plumb set up the brass rule in the following, and you can see that's what this illustration is here. Herald of Freedom, Lawrence, Kansas, G.W. Brown, editor, proprietor, $2 per annum. And so what happened is they actually made this stamp and stamped all of the money that Mrs. Brown came back home or came back to Lawrence with from back east, and then put it back out into circulation to promote the newspaper. So that was one of Plumb's contributions to the Herald of Freedom. At the same time, he's still sending letters back to his own newspaper, the Xenia News in Ohio. So he's running his own newspaper and working for the Herald of Freedom at the same time. He decides that he wants to found a town. And so he actually founds the town of Mariposa, which is near present-day Salina. And this, again, is all happening in the fall, winter of 1856. So he's just smuggled weapons. He's working at the Herald of Freedom. He's establishing his own town of Mariposa and still sending letters back to the Xenia News in Ohio. The man is busy. The town of Mariposa is heavily promoted within the Xenia News and also within the Herald of Freedom. He's publishing articles in there describing how wonderful this area is, how it's sure to be a go. It was not a go. There were some settlers who did move there. That first winter was incredibly rough. Many of them just froze out and starved. In fact, there's one story of a man who crawled inside the carcass of a buffalo to survive a blizzard one night. Kind of like in, was it the second Star Wars, Empire Strikes Back, and Luke Skywalker crawls in the Tauntaun? That was real, apparently. So the town of Mariposa was unsuccessful. But Emporia, as we all know, was not unsuccessful. He joins the Emporia Town Company with G.W. Brown from the Herald of Freedom at age 19 in 1857. So he has not yet turned 20 years old, and he is the 5th member of the Emporia Town Company. He is the last one to join, and it was a $1,000 buy-in, which $1,000 in 1857 is a lot of money. And in order to afford the buy-in, his parents back in Ohio had to mortgage their home. And they mortgaged their home. He got the money to buy in. The other condition of his buy-in was that he had to start a newspaper in Emporia, because that was one thing they didn't have in Mariposa. He didn't have a newspaper established there. So Emporia, the first thing they do is establish a newspaper. In fact, there was only one building in Emporia at the time. It was the hotel. It had a dirt floor, and that's where they opened the newspaper. The newspaper was called the Kansas News. The Z is on purpose. That indicated that it was a Free State-leaning paper. And he had a heck of a time getting the printing press to Emporia, because in order to get that, he had to go to Cincinnati, Ohio, and he had to bring it back through Missouri. And at this point, he was so involved with the Free State movement, he was recognizable. And so he was on one of the river boats headed to Cincinnati when he was recognized by some of the pro-slavery men. They said, "You're that Plumb guy. We're going to hang you at the next stop." And Plumb's personality was such that that didn't really deter him from mouthing off towards the men who had captured him on the boat. And this actually impressed another passenger on the boat who had some influence, and he was actually able to save Plumb's life, save him from being hung. And what's funny is that that man's son from Missouri later went on to become a U.S. Senator, and he served in the Senate with Plumb. So one of those small world sorts of things. After 1857, about 1858, 1859, he gets smallpox, terribly bad. And he gets smallpox on his way to Lawrence. So there's not much going on in Emporia. It's the hotel with the dirt floor, remember? So in order to get news to print in his newspaper, he has to come to Lawrence. Now at this point, his whole family has come from Ohio. They've set up a farm there in Emporia, and they have a couple of family horses. Well, if the horses are not being used by the family, Plumb can take those and ride to Lawrence. If they are used on the family farm, then he has to walk. And so he often walked to Lawrence to get the news. He would just leave Emporia. It might be 2 p.m. Well, nothing going on. Guess I'll head to Lawrence. And he'd just take off walking. And on one of these trips walking to Lawrence, he came across a man who had smallpox. And he had basically been quarantined from the family farm, from civilization there, as it were. We're all familiar with quarantine, unfortunately. And Plumb arranged to have a nurse essentially take care of him. It was a woman who had already had smallpox. And so he hired her to take care of this man, and he survived. Unfortunately, in the process of doing that and speaking with the man, Plumb came down with smallpox himself and was deathly ill. He was not expected to survive, but did. He was giving a speech in Emporia one night, and he had his hat on, which of course is very poor etiquette. When you're giving a speech, you should remove your hat. And the audience hollered at him to remove his hat, and when he did, they noticed he'd gone completely bald. He'd lost all of his hair from the smallpox. So it was very, very devastating for him. In the first Kansas State Senate, he is elected. So he's already in the state legislature. He also decides to become a lawyer because he's not doing enough things, right? So he goes back to Ohio for about 6 months and learns the law. He comes back, he's a lawyer, he's a notary, he is in the state legislature, he has the Kansas newspaper. At this point, he's sold the Xenia News, so at least only has one newspaper. And he's also serving as state Supreme Court reporter. And this is actually an excerpt of one of his Kansas News, I guess you'd call it sort of the classified section. And you kind of get an idea of his sense of humor. That top ad, "A governor for Kansas, men of principle and conscience need not apply." Kind of sounds like today's politics sometimes too. This was in late 1857, and of course what he's referring to is that at this point in December, the Kansas Territory had already had 5 governors and would get a 6th before the end of the year. But I also wanted to point out too, you can see he's selling cattle, he's selling land, he's a notary, he's a lawyer, he's a state Supreme Court reporter, newspaper editor. The man is a workaholic. This is also something else that he was doing. Everyone from Lawrence, I'm sure, is well aware, times were tough then as far as the border ruffians and pro-slavery men coming in, sacking towns, burning homes, that sort of thing. Emporia was no exception to that fear. They had their own militia, of which Plumb was in command. Also in command of that militia, he would often ride out with troops, and they would attempt to arrest those that they had thought were responsible for others of those types of events. And so this is actually a drawing from a court-martial in response to the sacking in the town of Humboldt. And Plumb is right here in the shirt with the white sleeves. This drawing was done many years after the fact because he has his trademark beard, which he actually didn't grow until after the Civil War. So fun fact there. The trial ended in a stalemate and the arrested were acquitted. This was something, though, that he did very often and was very involved in chasing down border ruffians, those sorts, anytime he could. In April of 1861, the Civil War breaks out, and Plumb wants to enlist immediately, but he doesn't. And the reason for that is because at the time in the state legislature, they were defining county boundaries and setting county seats. The people of Emporia want Emporia to be the county seat. And so he stays until that's accomplished, which is in the fall of 1862. And then he immediately resigns from the state legislature and resigns as state Supreme Court reporter. He's tasked with recruiting Company C as a recruiting lieutenant of the 11th Kansas Infantry. Very quickly, he's promoted to captain of Company C, and I say very quickly as in a matter of a couple of weeks. And a couple of weeks after that, he's elected major of the regiment. He was very, very popular with the men, very well known, very well respected, which is why he moved up the ranks so quickly. Their first main battle is the Battle of Prairie Grove. And what I want to focus on here is the 11th Kansas newspaper. So Plumb's a newspaper guy, and he's not the only one in the regiment. Edmund Ross is a newspaper guy, and there's some other newspapermen there as well. And so what they do is they decide to set up their own regimental newspaper, which they call the Buck and Ball. And the reason they call it the Buck and Ball is in reference to the weapons that they've been issued, which are antiquated, by Civil War terms, antiquated Prussian muskets. Think kind of War of 1812 vintage. These things are not new. They're oversized, they're heavy, they shoot a musket ball and then 3 shots of buckshot. And they're heavy and awkward. In fact, a lot of the men joke that they should have been classified as light artillery instead of infantry because of what they were carrying. And so they call the newspaper the Buck and Ball, and they get together. You can see it's dated December 6th, 1862. And they find this abandoned printing press that's been destroyed by the Confederate Army. They put it back together and they print one side of the newspaper. And this one side is a fantastic account of everything the regiment had been up to since they were mustered in just a couple months earlier. However, the Battle of Prairie Grove happens. And so all the men are called up front to the battle. And Plumb takes the newspapers that they've printed. They've only printed the first side. And they're printing it on regular paper. They're printing it on wallpaper. They're printing it on any kind of paper they can find. He rolls them all up into a bundle and throws them into a mail ambulance that's going, or an ambulance that's going by, carrying mail, men, supplies, that sort of thing. And then he goes off to fight the Battle of Prairie Grove. The regiment sees very fierce fighting during the battle. Again, this is their first heavy combat that they're exposed to. And then after the battle, they have to care for the wounded. They're sent different places to kind of, keep things under control, make sure there's not a counterattack. And after a few days, he's actually able to go back and find his newspapers. And so they go back to the printing press, which has been destroyed again, put it back together again, and then print the second half of the newspaper. And so this is why, if you've seen a copy of the Buck and Ball, they are extremely rare. They only printed about 1,500 copies, and there's only a few still in existence. But the backside describes the Battle of Prairie Grove, but the front is dated December 6th. In 1863, the 11th Kansas is converted to cavalry. Like all things government related, this is a painful process that takes a few months. When you're converted to cavalry, you get to get rid of your muskets and you're issued carbines. So some of the companies would get carbines and no horses, and some companies would get horses and no carbines. And so this happened for a few months to get everybody on the same page, where everybody had horses and carbines. One of the main things they were doing at this time was fighting bushwhackers along the Kansas and Missouri border, kind of traveling around, basically broken into smaller units. I've spoken with several Iraq and Afghanistan vets, and they describe it as something similar to what they've done over there, where you're broken down into what they call regimental combat teams. And so the 11th Kansas would be broken down into smaller units. They'd be partnered with men from other regiments, and groups of 20 to 25 would go in different directions. And they'd be going through the woods, they'd be going through looking for bushwhackers. Also, again, in Lawrence, many of you are familiar with Quantrill's raid. This was a big deal for Plumb. In fact, upstairs in the gallery, Plumb is mentioned up there, which is exciting. This is the only museum I've been to where Plumb is in an exhibit, so I get personally excited about it. For Quantrill's raid, this was something that Plumb kind of got thrown under the bus for. And so I want to kind of describe this to you a little bit. After the initial attack on Lawrence, Plumb is technically in command of the district, but he's headquartered in Kansas City. He's not in Lawrence. General Ewing is in Leavenworth, and Plumb is sending continuous dispatches to Ewing and to other officers in the area, attempting to coordinate some kind of interception with Quantrill's forces. Because as soon as Plumb gets word of where Quantrill might be going, which the initial word he gets is wrong, he starts heading in different directions. And so if you kind of imagine sort of like a game of telephone where he went this way and you go that way and you send dispatches. And then, no, he went that way. Now you go that way. And so this ended up resulting in a 24-hour pursuit for Plumb. In fact, at the end of it, he could not physically get off his horse. He had to be carried off his horse. For many of the men, their horses collapsed. Plumb's was one of them. His horse collapsed. His brother had to go find him another horse from a farm so that he could keep going in the pursuit. He was picking up men wherever he could. He ran into Jim Lane. He ran into some other men. He would coordinate things. You go this way, I'll go this way. And I'm sure, as you're all aware, it was kind of a disaster. But what's really interesting is that, and not well known, is that Plumb kept sending these dispatches back. And so one of these accounts, this is actually from Thomas Barber, who was of the 11th Kansas. He said, Plumb kept sending dispatches back to Kansas City, explaining how things were and all his actions in the pursuit of Quantrill, and asking Ewing to get every available man and assemble on the state line, and they would there get Quantrill. Ewing being away, these dispatches went to the regimental headquarters and were sent to Fort Leavenworth to Ewing by Major Martin Anderson. Ewing did not get them, having started down the field of action by DeSoto. Plumb was expecting that Quantrill would find Ewing in several companies across his path at the state line, but he could never hear a word from any dispatch he sent. Major Martin Anderson took what men he could and followed Plumb, and Barber went with him. At Olathe, they met a courier coming on the run, his horse in a foam. He saluted Major Anderson and said he had a dispatch from Plumb. Major Anderson took it and looked at it. It was to General Ewing, and Major Anderson sent him on to Kansas City with it. Major Anderson met two other couriers with dispatches from Plumb to Ewing and sent them on to Kansas City. Barber knows this for certain, for he saw them, but Ewing was then on the road south from Leavenworth to DeSoto and did not see them. Plumb was relying on him to be at the state line. And so there's this tremendous amount of miscommunication that's going on, but Plumb is doing his absolute best with the information that he has, the small number of men that he has, and as exhausted as they are. And what's interesting is that the story of these dispatches has never been told. Plumb never talked about this. And what's interesting is that this interview actually comes from Kansas historian William L.C. Conley, one of the most famous historians from Kansas. And even after these interviews, he made a note. He said, I'm now seeing that in order to aid General Ewing in his candidacy for the U.S. Senate, Major Plumb assumed much of the blame which ought to have fallen on Ewing, and Ewing was not man enough to publish Plumb's dispatches. So in other words, Plumb took the fall for Ewing. And these dispatches were never released. No one ever referenced them. And so because of that, for many years, in fact, for the rest of Plumb's life, there were many in Lawrence who did not like Plumb and blamed him for that. but they were never aware of the full situation. So that was something that I made sure I wanted to cover in this book. In 1864, he's promoted to lieutenant colonel. And this was a tough promotion because this came after Quantrill's raid. Again, he was still not really in the good graces of a lot of folks. And so Lawrence put a lot of pressure on the governor not to promote Plumb because of that. And again, it's a situation where they did not fully understand what was going on because those dispatches were never released. The other thing that they're doing is they're still fighting bushwhackers. This is, again, mostly what they're doing. However, in 1864, we get the Battle of Westport. This is a huge deal for the 11th Kansas. The Battle of Westport took place in Kansas City. I believe it is all fully developed now. You can't actually go to the site. But it's also sometimes called the Gettysburg of the West because this involved 30,000 soldiers. So this is more your traditional Civil War battle, Confederate Army on one side, Union Army on another side, rather than the guerrilla warfare of the bushwhackers that the 11th Kansas has been dealing with. This is a drawing that I had done of the Battle of Westport. Walter Wellhouse's account here describes it perfectly. But what was happening is the Confederate Army was entrenched behind a stone wall at the top of a hill. And they were in position to go down that hill and sweep right into Kansas. And the task of stopping them was left to Plumb and some companies of the 11th Kansas. And so what he ended up doing was leading a dismounted cavalry charge up a hill into the Confederate Army, again, entrenched behind a stone wall. Militarily, this is not ideal. This is not what you want to do. But the charge was successful. They were able to stop the Confederate assault. And because of that, the Confederate Army did not make it into Kansas at that time. So this was very, very significant for the 11th Kansas, a very significant battle that they were a part of. 1865, they are sent to the Wyoming Territory. In case any of you have been wondering why some woman from Casper, Wyoming is talking to you about this famous Kansan, this is why. This is how I found him while doing research just right in my hometown in Casper, Wyoming. This was a bone of contention for the men in the 11th Kansas. Some of them signed 3-year enlistments. Some of them signed 3-year or duration of the war, which means that when the war is over, they should go home. And they didn't. Instead, they got sent to the Dakota Territory, now present-day Wyoming, and were tasked with guarding the telegraph route. This was something that Plumb argued against. He petitioned the governor, all of the higher-ups within the military, trying to encourage a discharge of his men so they could be mustered out, because he did not feel it was right that they should be here. However, that, of course, fell on deaf ears. While they were sent to Wyoming Territory, they were stationed near Plattbridge Station, which is present-day Fort Casper. I know some of you have been there. That's actually where I work. They also set up Camp Dodge, which was their regimental headquarters. Camp Dodge has been lost to history until about 2 years ago. I have been trying to discover that location for a long time, and we ended up getting a donation from an 11th Kansas descendant that included a hand-drawn map of where Camp Dodge was. This was a location picked out by Colonel Plumb. He was not under orders to do so, but it was significant because most forts of that period are what you would call squares or rectangles, something walled in, everything clustered together. Camp Dodge was not like that. It was actually in a V formation, and it was split along 2 forks of Garden Creek. So it's actually right along the creek, which allowed them fresh access to water, close timber, and it was high enough elevation that they could actually see any incoming threats from all directions from this. So it was actually a very, very significant location to set up headquarters. Their first fighting was on June 3rd, which was a skirmish that took place with some members of the Sioux Native Americans who attacked Plattbridge Station and drew Plumb and some companies of 11th Kansas into a running fight that lasted about 10 miles. In some ways, this was similar fighting to the bushwhackers in that there was a take no prisoner situation. However, the tactics with Native Americans were very different. They would tend to fire on a post or fire on a party and then try to pull them into an ambush. And that's exactly what they did on June 3rd. And Plumb recognized that and was able to stop a full ambush from happening. He only lost 2 men out of all of the men that were with him. In July, he was sent to Fort Halleck. Fort Halleck is also in present-day Wyoming. It's kind of near the town of Laramie, Wyoming, if any of you have been to Laramie, where the University of Wyoming is. And while there, he was in charge of protecting the entire overland mail route. And under his command, there were no issues with the mail, no casualties, nothing of any kind. So he kept the mail route very safe. In September of 1865, he was finally home. They got orders to muster out in August, and it took about a month to get home because the government decided you don't need your horses, you can walk. And so a lot of them had to walk back. And this Home from the Wars Forever is actually his last diary entry. And he even underlined forever in his diary. And you can imagine how long it must have felt for him being involved with the Free State movement, smuggling weapons here in 1856, to almost a decade later, finally being discharged from military service. In 1867, he returns to civilian life in 1865. In 1867, he marries Carolyn Carey Southwick from Ohio. Her father was Abijah Southwick, who ran a very important Underground Railroad stop in Ohio. A strong abolitionist family. They had 6 children. One of them died when he was about 2 years old. Interestingly enough, the one that died, his name was Thomas Ewing Plumb. So even with all of the issues with Ewing from Quantrill's raid, Plumb still named a son after him. They were very close at that time. Also, he becomes president of the Emporia National Bank. He returns to the state legislature. Also in 1867, he is Speaker of the House, the state of Kansas, and his law firm, Ruggles and Plumb, is one of the most successful in the state. He would travel all over the state of Kansas. He would take clients on as far away as Texas, Nebraska. He traveled all over. And one of the reasons he later became president of the Emporia National Bank was because he was traveling so much with his law firm. He decided to scale back on that and focus on working more in Emporia because they had such a large family. As president of the bank, he was very well respected, very well known in the community. If the bank would not loan you money, he would loan you money. There are numerous stories of farmers in the area about to lose their homesteads. They couldn't come up with the money. They had no collateral to secure a loan. Plumb would loan them money at 0 interest from his own money to make sure they could keep their homesteads. At one point, a plague of grasshoppers devoured all of the crops around Emporia, and the farmers needed more seeds to replant, but they couldn't afford the seeds. And the merchant who sold seeds couldn't afford to give them all away. I mean, he's got bills to pay too. So Plumb paid for all of the seeds for all of those farmers so they could replant their crops, and all of those farmers paid him back except one, and that ones were questionable. He might have actually paid back. So he was very, very willing to help others, to loan money, to do whatever he could to help those in Emporia. In 1877, he's elected as a Republican senator from Kansas and immediately goes to work introducing bills. This is kind of funny. Apparently, there's this unspoken rule that when you're elected to the Senate and you're new, your job is to just sit there. You just learn your place, learn how things go. Don't introduce bills, don't stand up and talk. Well, that's not Plumb. He ran for the Senate because he had things to do. And so he did. And there's a great story in here. Let me see if I can find it. That really just describes his personality. This man, Colonel O.E. Larned, described a story. It says, when Larned first went to Washington after Plumb's election to the Senate, senators there accosted him with, "What kind of fellow is this that you have sent us from Kansas? He makes motions and sustains them with speeches, and then alone votes for them. He acts like a wild fellow." "Just wait," said Larned, "and you fellows will be voting for his motions. He's all right in what he's doing, and you will see it soon." He really turned the Senate on its head when he first got there. And one of the first bills that came up that he voted against was to reinstate a man who had been discharged from the Army, had actually been court-martialed. And he was looking to be reinstated because he had become famous. And really what this boiled down to is he wanted his pension. And so because he was well known, this was supposed to just kind of cruise right through the Senate with no problems. Plumb didn't think this was right. And so he stood up, the new senator from Kansas, and made speeches against it. And when it came down to voting it, he was the only person in the Senate who voted against it. But he voted against it because he didn't think it was right. This would be something that he would become very well known for. The other thing I want to point out, Plumb had what I would call a photographic memory and then some. He was well known for doing multiple things at once. So he would be up in the Senate and he'd be addressing you like what I'm doing here, and then he'd be flipping through papers and still talking to you. And people in the gallery would joke, oh, look at this senator from Kansas. He doesn't even know what he's talking about. He's got to read from his notes. No, he was reading his mail. So he would make a speech in the Senate and he would read his mail at the same time. There are many, many stories of people coming to see him in his offices in Washington, and they would have a meeting with him. They wanted to visit with him about something, and he'd say, sure, come on in. And they'd have a conversation with him while at the same time he's dictating 2 letters simultaneously to 2 different stenographers and reading the newspaper. He subscribed to every newspaper in the state of Kansas, so he had a lot to read, and he would just bounce from one topic of conversation to another, and he never lost his place. There's another story of a senator who traveled with him to Monticello, and they were on the train having a conversation, and Plumb was reading a book. And the senator said, either you're not getting anything out of the book or you haven't been listening to anything I've been saying. And Plumb said, no, I've been listening and I've been reading the book. And he closed the book and handed it to him and said, give me a page number. And so the senator said, 85. And then Plumb would start to recite what was on page 85. He had that kind of memory. This made him a force to be reckoned with in the Senate because as soon as another senator wanted to argue, Plumb had a tremendous command of facts, figures, laws, and could recite these things basically to no end. So he was very, very intimidating for other people to go up against in the Senate. And because of that, his reputation grew fast in the Senate. So fast so that in 1880, he's heavily involved in the James A. Garfield presidential nomination. At the time, Ulysses S. Grant, James Blaine, and John Sherman, brother of William Tecumseh Sherman, were the leading candidates to be the Republican nominee for president. Garfield was sort of this dark horse candidate. Well, what happened is that no one could agree on who the nominee was going to be. And a friend of Plumb's was there. His name's Ben Simpson, a friend since the war. And he described to Connolly how all of these meetings were held in a hotel at the convention where things were ironed out, details about who's Plumb going to vote for. And the reason Plumb became significant in this is because many, many other senators within the Republican Party would not count their vote towards someone or would not go on the record voting for a candidate until they knew who Plumb was voting for. They wanted to get in line behind Plumb. Plumb wasn't asking them to do that, but because of his influence in the Senate, they wanted to make sure that they stayed on his good side. And so Plumb and Garfield actually had a couple of meetings one night in Garfield's hotel room. They sat together on Garfield's steamer trunk and hammered out the details of this. And then Plumb said, all right, I will give you my support. Unfortunately, Garfield was elected president and then almost immediately assassinated. And he had promised to help Kansas after becoming president. What those details of that would have been, we don't know. But already having only been in the Senate for 3 years, Plumb's influence is incredibly powerful. These are just some of his Senate accomplishments. This would take pages and pages if I listed all of them. But the separation of the Department of Agriculture, this is a big deal. Plumb introduced a bill that made the Department of Agriculture its own federal department. He made it a cabinet position. It had not been prior to that. This was very important for any agriculturally based states like Kansas, but many other states as well. By making it a cabinet position, now that person who is in charge of the Department of Agriculture has the ear of the president. They can regularly be involved in the Senate for presentations. They can be called upon for meetings and in committee meetings. Very, very significant. He got a lot of pushback getting this through. This was not an easy thing to pass, but he did. He also created and introduced some of the first forestry and conservation laws. He introduced the first forestry laws that then later became the basis for the U.S. Forest Service as we know it today. Prior to that, there was no regulation on forestry, mining, anything of that nature. In fact, out of that, he also pushed in the Senate the legislation that created Yosemite National Park and Sequoia National Park. In Wyoming, he's responsible for the creation of the Shoshone National Forest, which is very important for us today. He was the chairman of the Public Lands Committee for the majority of his career in the Senate. Again, this is an incredibly powerful position, if not one of the most powerful positions. At the time of the 1880s, this is when railroads are going in all over the United States, and many of the railroads are using federal land grants to put in their railroad lines. All of those land grants go through the Committee of Public Lands. Plumb has oversight and approval of where those railroads are going to be built. Every railroad in the United States that goes through a federal land grant goes through Plumb's desk. So again, incredibly powerful position there. Countless veterans pensions. At the time of his death in 1891, Plumb had submitted about 6,000 pension requests for veterans. To put that in perspective, most other senators introduced about 30 per session. This would put Plumb at about 500 or a little less per session. He was very involved with veterans organizations, very happy to help veterans. Whenever anyone came to him with a request for an issue, he took care of it personally. He did not have staffers that did things for him. If they sent him a letter, someone in Kansas sent him a letter, you got a response from him personally. At the time of his death, he was getting over 300 letters a day, and he answered all of them. The McKinley Tariff was another bill that Plumb was very heavily involved in. There were many Republicans that were opposed to the McKinley Tariff. When it came to a vote, initially there were about a dozen or so that were against it. And over time, pressure was applied to those senators in the form of threats and also in the form of bribery to basically come on board and support the McKinley Tariff. Plumb did not. He did not agree with it. He thought the costs were too high, would inflate the cost of goods too much. He did not support the McKinley Tariff. When the vote was finally done and the McKinley Tariff passed, he was one of only 3 senators that voted against it, despite having been threatened, offers of bribery, that sort of thing. He was an incredibly honest and forthright senator. If he did not agree with something, he would not vote for it. He did not care if he was the only one that would vote against it. He did not care if it broke with party line. If he didn't think it was right, he wasn't for it. And so because of that, he was heavily criticized in newspapers at times for breaking from party lines. The final campaign. So in 1891, the populist movement is gaining steam in Kansas. And the populist movement is essentially an offshoot of the Republican Party, and it's fracturing the party. And so Plumb wants to do a campaign around the state of Kansas and try to bring some of these people who are leaning populist back into the fold of the Republican Party. And so he asked for help from other high-ranking and influential Kansas politicians. Former Senator Ingalls was one of them. They all turned him down. So he said, fine, I'll do it myself. And so he planned this grueling campaign schedule where he went almost to every small town he could in Kansas. And he would ride in a wagon, he'd give a speech, he'd hop back in the wagon. There's stories of him riding a horse to a creek where he has to get into a boat, row a boat across to get to the other side where there's a wagon for him. He hops in the wagon and heads to the next town. It was almost continuous. During this time, like many of his other times in the Senate when he was very stressed out, sometimes he'd forget to eat for a couple of days. He would not sleep for a couple of days. It was very taxing on his health. There's also stories of him on the campaign trail eating whiskey and oysters, a pint of each, mixed together. which I'm sure that didn't do any favors for his health either. He was successful in preserving Republican votes after this campaign, but the cost was high. He ended up basically overworking himself. He died of a massive stroke December 20th, 1891 in Washington, D.C. His body laid in state in Washington there for a few days. The president, vice president, cabinet members, many senators all came to pay their respects. Then his body was brought to Topeka, where there was a funeral procession, which is this photograph here. 15,000 mourners turned up in Topeka. He was that popular, he was that well known, that well liked. Then the body was brought to Emporia, and there's a photograph there of the procession in Emporia, where another 3,000 members or mourners came to Emporia. His body was taken to the home there, where it was under guard from members of the 11th Kansas and the local GAR post who are in that photograph there before he was buried in Emporia. Plumb holds the distinction of being the only Kansas United States senator to ever be unanimously reelected. At the time he was in the Senate, senators were elected by the state legislature. And in 1889, he was reelected unanimously. All members of the Republican Party voted for him. Members of other parties either voted for him or they were absent the day that the vote took place so as not to vote against him. He was that well respected with members of the opposite party that even though they might know, well, it's going to be a Republican senator, but if it's going to be a Republican, I want it to be Plumb because he's someone I can work with. But it gives you an idea of just how well respected and how popular he was at the time. His legacy, this was just kind of a personal side note for it. There's a photograph of his wife, Carrie, taken some years after the fact. Because he died so suddenly, there were no preparations for that. And so the family, the estate, received hundreds of lawsuits against it from all over the country. It was so bad that Carrie could not travel to certain states for fear of being served papers. And a lot of these lawsuits were from businesses. They were essentially scams. Oh, your husband, he said he was going to pay us $100 and he didn't pay, but here's the invoice. Oh, your husband said he was going to buy these shares in this company and it's $1,000. And this is a very well-known scam at the time, and they hoped that the widow would be so overcome in grief that she would just write the checks and pay for it. Plumb's estate was very wealthy, and so they tried to take advantage of that. And it got so bad that one of his business partners in Emporia was actually blackmailing her at the time. Carrie fought off every single lawsuit. There were over 300 of them, and the estate won every single one. And she remained in Emporia, Kansas, and was involved in a lot of the same causes that he was. She was tremendously helpful to the GAR. She was involved with building of libraries in Emporia and other towns. Very, very, very prolific woman herself. And this is the last slide I wanted to end on. Plumb was so popular that in 1889, this famous Broadway playwright, David D. Lloyd, and famous Broadway actor, William H. Crane, needed a senator to model for their play, The Senator. And the character of the senator, Senator Rivers, is fictitious, but he is 100% Preston Plumb. From the way he looks, you can see William Crane has the same beard there. His personality, his mannerisms, everything of Plumb's was incorporated into The Senator. The play was a runaway hit on Broadway. It ran for 119 performances. It toured the country and was later made into a silent film in 1915. Senators would go to the play and they would see William Crane do certain things. He'd stand up and talk to give a speech, and he'd pat the back of his neck with a handkerchief, which was something Plumb always did in the Senate, and they would just laugh because they would recognize him. The script was never filed with the Library of Congress, and the last performance of the senator was in 1915 until last month. I found the script while doing research for my book. William Connolly, when he was working on his biography of Plumb, had written to William H. Crane and asked for a copy of the script. Crane still had it in 1910, sent it to Connolly. Connolly duplicated it, sent it back. And when Connolly turned in all of his notes to the State Historical Society when he retired, that script was in there. And so if you're interested in seeing the senator, you can go on YouTube and search for the Fort Caspar Museum Association. That's our YouTube channel, and you can actually watch a performance of the senator. If you want to get an idea of what Plumb was like in life, as far as his mannerisms, how he spoke, that sort of thing, that's as close as you can get. I worked very closely with Will, the actor who played Senator Rivers, and he did a fantastic job. So I just wanted to put that out there in case anyone wanted to take a look at it. And I have rambled a lot of Plumb facts at you very quickly. Does anyone have any questions?
Did he ever connect with William Allen White?
He did not. He died in 1891, but the Plumb family gave William Allen White a lot of the money that he needed to start his newspaper. And Plumb's son, Dale, was actually a fraternity brother of William Allen White. So they were very good friends, but they didn't quite overlap because when Plumb died, he was only 54 years old and died so young. Yeah.
Well, there's a little town in northwest Bergen County named Xenia. Was there any connection with that?
Not that I know of. No, not to Plumb.
He obviously was anti-slavery because he moved to Kansas.
Very much
That was
so.
one of his motives for it. Was he active during the war as an officer in helping freed people and people seeking freedom?
That is a great question. So yes, he was. And in fact, before the war had broken out, but before he enlisted, there was actually an escaped slave that came through Emporia, and he had stolen a horse from a farm on the way to get there. And so he'd been arrested for theft. And so he was going to go to trial there in Emporia. Well, the people of Emporia hired Plumb to defend him. And so Plumb took him to, defended him in court and was able to basically hang the jury and got him off on some technicalities. Well, the prosecution was going to refile, and in the amount of time it would take to refile, he gave the man enough money that he could get further north before they could arrest him again. So he was involved in things like that. His family was known for taking in escaped slaves. In fact, there's many stories from Emporia that families there thought the Plumb family was strange because they ate at the same dinner table as escaped slaves. During the war, the 11th Kansas took in 10 African-American soldiers. They were enlisted as undercooks. However, they were issued weapons, which is somewhat unusual. A lot of the more federalized regiments, undercooks were just that. They were undercooks. One of them was actually wounded at the Battle of Platte Bridge in Casper, Wyoming in 1865, which the only way he could have been wounded would have been if he had left the fort itself, gone across the bridge, and had been in the fighting. And there's another story of one of the African-American soldiers actually paying the $8 to keep his U.S. Navy issued revolver. So for the 11th Kansas, they did bring African-Americans in as soldiers. There's a lot of stories of them trying to help refugees get across. There's a story of the 11th Kansas taking a riverboat, and the riverboat captain refused to captain it because there were black people on board. And so Plumb said he'll either captain it or I'll shoot him. He managed to captain the boat. So yeah, he was very, very, very abolitionist himself. Yes. Any other questions or comments or? Yeah.
Are there any relatives of his living today?
There are. So in Emporia, there are descendants of his brother George that still live there. As far as his own direct descendants, there are none in the state of Kansas, which is probably another reason that he's kind of slipped through the cracks historically, is he does not have direct family here. In the process of working on this book, I've met descendants from 3 of his children. Only 4 of them had kids. So I've got a great deal of information from the family, but yes, he does still have descendants that are living. Yeah.
So what made you discover him?
I actually found him while I was doing research for my master's thesis on Camp Dodge, that regimental headquarters in Casper. The story of Camp Dodge for us in Casper had kind of been lost. For a long time, we thought it was just a lumber camp. We thought it was maybe half a dozen guys with hatchets out there chopping down trees. We did not realize it was the regimental headquarters for 11th Kansas. Then I found out that it had buildings, it had tents, it was an elaborate thing. And so then I thought, okay, well, this is the creation of this guy, Preston Plumb. Who's Preston Plumb? And so then I went on his Wikipedia page and, oh, he's done this and this and this. And I got Connolly's book and I read through that and I thought, wow, this guy has done a lot. But yet nobody seems to know anything about, nobody's heard of him. And even in Emporia, there's the connection to Plumb Hall. There's the Plumb name is familiar, but who Preston Plumb was has also kind of been lost. And when I went to Emporia to do some research on the 11th Kansas, I found all of these interviews that William Connolly conducted between 1910 and about 1912 for his book on Plumb. Hundreds and hundreds of interviews with soldiers, fellow senators, frontier settlers, all sorts of people. And none of these stories were used in his book. He just used the names and the dates and that sort of thing. And so I copied all that information and I thought I'm going to focus on the stories because to me that's, that's what history is. It's stories about people and just an incredibly fascinating life, what he did in 54 years. Yeah.
When you were collecting all the information through his letters and articles, were there any big hurdles that you ran into when collecting it? Was it just the lack of information about his life? Or?
Probably the only thing that would really be a hurdle would be the lack of information about his personal life, the family life. Being a senator, he's in the newspaper almost too much. I mean, you search his name, there's a lot of things that come up. Connolly interviewed so many people that knew him. He did collect some interviews with the family, but he and the family did not get along. And so if you've read Connolly's book, there's literally one line in there that says, Preston Plumb married Carolyn Southwick in 1867. They had 6 children, 5 of which survived. And that is it. There's no other mention in there. And I was really struggling with how to incorporate that in the book. And I cold called this lady on Ancestry. She had a picture of Preston Plumb Jr. on her Ancestry page. I contacted her and I said who I was. And I said, by any chance, do you happen to have anything? I would really love a copy of the picture. Do you happen to have anything? And she had all sorts of family letters and she was so kind. She mailed them all to me, FedExed me about a 15-pound box of papers, hundreds of papers. And in there were tons of letters from him to Preston Jr., letters from Carrie to Preston Jr. And so from that, I was able to piece a little bit more of his personal life together. So that was a big hurdle. The other thing was the sheer volume of information. I was telling them earlier, I've got about 22,000 computer files of Plumb stuff. And that's files, so those can be 50 pages, 100 pages, or 1 page. And so it was a lot to go through all of those and then sort them. It was a monumental task. So, yeah, I'm happy with how it turned out, though. Yeah.
Do you know anything about that 1915 silent film?
That 1915 film, unfortunately, is one of the many silent films that has been lost. Other than that, I don't know a whole lot about it. I've only been able to see one still image that survives from it.
So you don't know who the star might have been or what company made it?
I used to know the name of the actor, but offhand, I can't tell you. It was not William H. Crane. He didn't reprise his role for the film, but I couldn't tell you offhand who it was. Yeah.
What do you know about his role in naming Kansas counties? Have you come across any of that in your research at all?
Yes, he was involved in that. I can't think of the name of the county. There's one county in the state legislature he put through to have named after a fallen soldier. And he was also involved with the naming of Lyon County because it used to be Breckenridge. But I do have that story saved. That's in one of my 22,000 computer files. But off the top of my head, I could not tell you. But he was involved in that, yes. Yes. Any other questions? Yeah.
This isn't about him in particular, but you mentioned that the Z in when spelling like Kansas, that represents a free state.
Right.
Why is that?
I don't know exactly the significance of the Z. I don't know if you know that.
No, Virgil, do you know that?
Well, it was, Z was used in some maps. early
Yeah.
on, And I think it was just a variation.
Yeah.
It was a variation of.
I've never heard that it was connected particularly with the Free State movement.
And see, there were a couple of people that Connolly had interviewed that said that I guess it was, I don't know, maybe it was kind of a subtle nod to the Free State movement, just so that people, when they're looking at the newspaper, right at the masthead, they immediately know what kind of leaning newspaper it's going to be. But yeah, in particular, like I say, I've seen it both spellings, but why the Free State movement kind of adopted that, I'm not sure, except to maybe subtly let people know what it was.
Maybe it's in your 22,000 files somewhere.
I
You gotta
missed
search.
something. It could be.
All right. Thank you.